He's done it all. Please welcome distinguished author Sebastian Faulks in conversation with author Janice Pariat.
Hi. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, it is afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's lovely to be here. I hope you can all hear me. Excellent. Thank you. Okay. So a very, very warm welcome to Sebastian. It's fantastic to be in conversation with you today. I'm going to start with a very, very small anecdote. It was many years ago. I was a student in London, and I had applied for a little internship at the BBC for a program called The Big Read. I don't know if you remember it. I think it was in 2003 or something. So The Big Read was this TV show that was conducting this nationwide survey to discover the country's most beloved, most favorite novel. And I got a call saying, will you come in? And off I traipsed to the BBC office in White City at that time. And I found myself amidst this group of people who were lovely and literary and very stressed, making this program. And I joined them when they were down to 21 books. So it had gone from 200 to 100 to 50, down to 21. And there were the usual suspects: Gone with the Wind, Great Expectations, lots of Harry Potters, Catcher in the Rye, and I'd read most of them, thanks to my very heavy sort of Anglo-Saxon inclined education. But there was one book that I hadn't yet read and that I hadn't yet come across, and it was a book called Birdsong, and by a writer named Sebastian Faulks. So I stole a copy from the office and I went back to my room in Halls and read it and was tremendously moved by it. I loved it. It was the first war novel that I'd ever read. It was the last war novel that I ever read. I was devastated, and I thought, I can't do this. So thanks to you, Sebastian, I know nothing about war novels. So I was hoping for people like me and for people like us, who have perhaps read Birdsong and then never another war novel again, perhaps you could just identify or outline for us a British/English tradition of writing on war. And by war, I mean specifically the First and Second World War. And if you could contextualize your writing, your war novels within that space for us. Yeah?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be here, and thank you for coming along. And I hope you gave the copy of Birdsong that you'd stolen back.
Yes, I did.
I've still got a few books on my shelves which say things like Emmanuel College Library and BBC Not to be Taken Away. The book you referred to, Birdsong, I think it was voted number 13, wasn't it? Unlucky.
It was.
My favourite number, actually, in the nation's all-time favourite novels, which was very kind of people. But I'm almost certain Harry Potter was the winner, wasn't it? I can't remember.
Actually, it was Lord of the Rings.
Oh, it was Lord of the Rings,
happy
okay.
to say, yes.
Fine.
Followed closely by Pride and Prejudice.
Right. So I suppose that book, Birdsong, well, it's probably it's sold more than any other book I've written, and it has a sort of, it's the 25th anniversary this year, so they're doing yet another edition. I have to write yet another introduction. But I'm now officially demobilized. I'm not writing about war anymore. But just to very briefly put that in context, I'd always been very interested by the First World War because it was something that seemed to baffle and horrify my olders and betters when I was growing up. And the history teachers who were happy to teach you about the Tudors and the Stuarts and so on, when it came to the First World War, they just looked the other way, really. And I think maybe it was because some of them had older brothers or some had lost friends or something like that. I could never quite do the mathematics to work it out, but my grandfather fought in it, and my father fought in the Second World War. And I assumed that I would fight in the Third World War, which seemed, when I was growing up, to be very imminent. the Cuban Missile Crisis, I was 9 or 10, I suppose, and so on. So it was a very big part of growing up in England, the sense of war, repetition and the background and so on. And I formed this determination when I was quite young that I would one day try and understand this appalling Holocaust that had happened between 1914 and 1918. And one day I was asked when I was about 12 to read out the names of all the boys who died in the 2 world wars from my school. It was only a little school, only about 80 boys. But by the time I'd read the names of all those who had died, my throat was absolutely raw and I could no longer speak. And I thought, something pretty strange must have happened here. So I put away this little determination to the back of my mind that one day when I was grown up, I'd come back and understand this thing. Of course, there is quite a big literature from the First World War, but it's mostly written by officers, and it's mostly written sometime after the events. 1928, for some reason, was a year when a lot of stuff started to come out. Goodbye to All That by Robert Graves, which is a beautiful book, but it doesn't really tell you much about the actual experience of the moment of fighting and the fear and all that. And it's a very, very presumptuous thing to do, to think that as someone who has never been a soldier, never been in danger of any description, apart from, riding a motorbike slightly too fast, how on earth could one possibly portray these extraordinary events in which 10 million men were killed for reasons which we still struggle to understand? Birdsong was therefore the 4th novel I'd written, and it was by then, I suppose, I felt I was 39 at the time. I felt now's the time, I'm grown up enough now, I've got enough experience. And I spent a long, long time in the Imperial War Museum, which has marvelous collections of documents left by ordinary men, letters home, diaries, all sorts of things. And it was through them, through the first-hand experience, that I began to feel a sort of connection and began to feel that I had the authority to have a go at this. But it still felt an impossibly difficult thing to do, and I fully expected that it would fail. And when my editor at the publishers said, she'd just arrived, she said, "I'm just catching up with all you guys, what are you up to now?" And I said, "I'm writing a novel set in the First World War." And she said, "Oh my God, no one's interested in that." She was Canadian, that's my Canadian accent. But she sighed and said, "Okay, well, we'll do the best we can." But it was a subject at that point that no one really cared to think about, which has changed.
Right. Well, what strikes me, Sebastian, is actually, because I've spent weeks now immersed in your writing, just as I was telling you, and as you can see around me, there's just these little piles of Sebastian's books, and there's many, many more. I couldn't fit them all in. So Sebastian has a large, substantial body of work, and of course, a lot of them are war novels, and a lot of them, well, actually, are about very, very different things. And that's what struck me when I was moving through your work, that there's such an incredible range, and it's absolutely sort of, fascinating to me as a reader and as a writer that, someone can do that, can pull that off. And I'm interested in knowing how you do it. How do you craft this experience for your readers? How do you keep in mind who you're writing for when you're doing this? And you've done this a lot, and will hopefully do a lot more too.
I never wanted to be the kind of writer who wrote the same book again and again, which a lot of people do. And I think it was helpful to me to have had another job first. I was a journalist for quite a long time. And being a journalist teaches you how to ask questions and how to find things out, and not to just sit on your backside and recycle your own life in thin and rather unconvincing disguise. And you then, as trying to learn how to do it, is a question of reading endlessly and then copying other people, seeing how that works or why it doesn't work, and not just saying, "Oh, this is a great novel." You read Zola, for instance, or Tolstoy, or I'll give you an example. Reading Tolstoy, he's very good at portraying happiness, which is famously very, very difficult to portray. Happiness writes white, as they say. But the way that Tolstoy portrays happiness is he doesn't say Anna felt a surge of joy or Prince Andrei suddenly felt very happy. What he describes is people doing things that they're good at very well. And it might be riding horses, hunting, or it might be harvesting, as famously in Anna Karenina. And so rather than just say, oh, that's wonderful, isn't Tolstoy great? I thought to myself, good idea, I'll copy that. So, there's in a book called On Green Dolphin Street, for instance, which is quite a sad book about a love affair, and the background is the Cold War, there's a lot of tension in the air. I thought, if this was a film, we'd now have a collage, a montage scene, we're showing people having fun. So I got them to go sailing. I just showed them doing something that they were good at, rather than just saying, Mary felt so in love or something. So, you just sort of learn these things from other people. But I think I do always have the reader very much in mind. And the session earlier this morning, people were talking about the readers. Are they women? Are they men? Are they? And people have different views on. I don't have a particular reader in mind. But I do have a hypothetical person to whom I am talking. And one of the things that fascinates me about writing fiction is that it's a sort of triangular relationship, really. You have your main character and the situation he or she is in there, and then you are down here, the writer, and the reader is here, and you're both looking at the main character. But it is possible to talk to the reader down here as well, behind the back of the character. So one of the ways you do this, there's an English writer called Henry Green who was very good at doing this. He would almost make you, the writer, write the book for you, and you had the impression that you understood his characters better than he did. And so when he made them do something, you said, no, they wouldn't do that, Henry, what are you talking about? And it's a subtle thing, this, and I don't want to bore you by going into too much technical detail about it. But, for instance, in Birdsong, it was very important for me because I knew what was going to happen at the end, that the main character was going to be trapped underground and was eventually going to be heroically somehow got out of there. Something that I copied from Zola, actually, a book called Germinal, which is about a coal mine and someone is hauled out. I shouldn't give away too many trade secrets about too many things, but Zola's dead now, so he's not going to sue me. But the trouble is that, the convention is when you read a book, the main character will be okay because he's the hero survives. And I wanted the reader not to have that idea. So basically halfway through the book, the hero's Stephen's best friend, Michael Weir, is killed. He's just standing up in a trench and a bullet goes straight through his head. And the reason that I wanted this to happen is that so the reader would think, this writer is such a bastard. He's killed the nicest guy in the book for no reason. We cannot rely on him to rescue the hero at the end. So, but again, I'm slightly talking to the reader, really, behind the back of the characters there. So I am very, very engaged with the reader. And I suppose what I would like to think is the ideal of the novel that I try to write is that I will take the reader to a journey into experiences that he or she has never had before, meeting people the like of which he or she has never had before, and having to entertain really difficult thoughts about the nature of human beings, how we function, why we don't function, but all in a way that they find quite palatable and enjoyable getting through. And I want them to get, at the end, to think, God, I thought I'd got in the car to go to the shops, but I've ended up on the other side of the world. I didn't feel it. It was the transportation was so expertly done. But of course, I am the jet engines. I'm the feet under the water paddling furiously, so that it all feels effortless for the reader. That's what I hope.
Oh, that's just absolutely lovely, and I think it also sort of harkens back to what you were saying yesterday, that all of us have read books like that have changed our lives, that have taken us on these marvelously transportive journeys, and that's why we're here. And that's just, and that's why we love what we do and we love what we read. But just to very quickly go back to what you were saying a little earlier on in your answer about the art of copying, the art of pastiche. In fact, Sebastian is affiliated to a number of literary programs, both for TV and the radio back in the UK, and one of them is called The Right Stuff. I think we've stolen our session title from there for this one. It's a radio quiz show, and one of the components of the game, of the show, is that the teams have to write a pastiche of a particular author of the week. So you have to copy Mark Twain or the Bronte sisters or Jane Austen. And of course, you were talking about copying in the sense of learning something from them as you go along, as you read along. But the two books that were literary homages that you were commissioned to write, which was James Bond, ta-da, and Jeeves and Wooster, who we all love, those were commissioned copies in a sense. So what was the experience of that, of having to actually turn that into a craft?
Okay, James Bond. So let's lighten it up, it's not all about the nature of human consciousness and tragedy and the background of history. I received a call, or rather my agent, that's not my special or secret agent, but my literary agent, received a call from the Fleming family. So it's the centenary of Ian Fleming's birth. Would Sebastian like to write a James Bond story? And I thought they must have got the wrong guy, because I don't write thrillers, I don't read thrillers, I don't know anything about thrillers. But I did, of course, see the James Bond films when I was a teenager, I suppose. And I said, I don't think I can do this. And then they said, well, there will be a lot of money. And
I can do this.
I thought about it a bit. And the Fleming family are a very strange family. I mean, they were incredibly nice to me, but they were one of the wealthiest families in the world, with their own bank and so on. But they are very, very, very fond of the black sheep of the family, Ian. And they are very, very protective of him and very proud of him. But they were extremely nice to me, very easy to deal with. And I said, all right, well, look, I'll read the books. And if I can think of a story, I'll send it to you, and just an outline, which I did. And I wrote an outline. And the important thing was to find a part of the world that Ian Fleming hadn't written about. Well, that wasn't too hard, because he didn't like the Middle East. He had unkind things to say about the Middle East. So I thought Iran, Russia, border, it could be interesting, that sort of area, both in the time the books are set in the 60s, but also still today. There's very interesting and slightly menacing countries in their different ways. And anyway, I wrote this story, and I just took everything that seemed good out of Bond, like Felix Leiter, the CIA agent, the girl, got to have a girl. But I thought, well, the girls are really good, let's have two.
Twins.
Twins yet. But I couldn't really do a sort of dolly bird, so I made the woman rather cleverer than James Bond himself, which was incredibly good fun. And anyway, they said, this outline looks fine, but you can't have a shootout in a caviar factory. And I said, that's just perfect, James Bond. He said, yes, it is, but it's been done in one of the films. It was done in a Pierce Brosnan film, which I hadn't seen. Anyway, I said, any other tips? And they said, well, yeah, actually, I'm going to send you an article that Ian Fleming wrote. It's called How to Write a Thriller. I said, that could be handy. So they sent me this article, and in it, Ian Fleming described how he would write a James Bond book, and his day in Jamaica, where he used to write. And he got up at 9 o'clock, a cup of coffee brought by his servant, went down, swam, a bit of snorkeling, came up, worked for 2 hours, and then a couple of dry martinis, lunch, snooze, swim, snorkeling, more snorkeling, and then back to his desk for 2 more hours in the evening, and then Noel Coward would come round for dinner, a couple of dry martinis, bottle of wine, and maybe just tidy up before going to bed at 1 o'clock. So it took him 6 weeks to write a James Bond book, so I set myself exactly the same program and exactly the same daily routine in London, though obviously I had to cut back a bit on the snorkeling. But apart from that, I followed his recipe very, very closely, and it took me 6 weeks from start to finish. And it was very good to write that fast, because there's something about working fast, and it's an action story that I thought the speed of writing would somehow keep the speed of the story going.
Right. And were you in Jamaica?
Sadly not, I was in West London. not much sea bathing, but it was very good fun. And then there was a hideous embarrassment of publicising it and having to dress up and meet scantily clad models and pose with guns and so on, which was just excruciating for a shy author who spends all his life locked up in a silent room. But I got through it, and the book was, most people liked it.
And did P.G. Wodehouse leave a little handy essay behind as well? How to write a really funny book?
Wodehouse came a few years later, and I was fairly confident I could do Bond once I got the story sorted, because Ian Fleming's style is not very difficult to imitate. It's a newspaperman style. Yes. Short sentences, lots of verbs, very few adverbs, almost no semicolons. It's pretty easy to imitate. Yeah. P.G. Wodehouse, on the other hand, is one of the most delicate and gifted prose stylists of the 20th century. I mean, okay, the books are comic, they're funny, but the style is incredibly delicate, like spun sugar, and I really wasn't confident I could pull that off. Also, I didn't want to get a reputation as being a sort of guy who wrote other men's books. I wanted to write my own.
Your own.
So I sort of rather turned my nose up at this and said, I can't possibly do it. Unfortunately, though, I was actually stuck at that point in the book that I was writing, and I was coming to India, actually, to play cricket in Rajasthan, as you do, and I just put a Jeeves and Wooster book in the suitcase, and I read it on the plane, and I just had a little idea. I thought, suppose they change places, the master becomes the servant the master. An idea which is as old as old can be. But anyway, I came back and rather shamefacedly said, well, if you're still on for it, I'll give it a go. And so I did it, and it was incredibly good fun. I mean, it was so nice to spend. It took more than 6 weeks. It took about 4 or 5 months. But to spend that time in the company of these characters that someone else had created, and I found that I was able to channel them, and it was just a sort of joy to spend time in this world where everyone is kind and all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. And
a nostalgic variation, I think you called it.
Yes.
Yes.
So no, that was an incredibly good experience. In the book, I know that Wodehouse has quite a big following in India. Yeah. It's very odd which parts of the world he does. Yeah. America a bit, India, and the other places the book sold was behind the Iron Curtain, or before former Iron Curtain countries. His only other foreign sales were in Russia, Romania, Bulgaria, and places like. Quite how Wodehouse spoke to these countries, and maybe it was because it was just fantastic escape into a different and perhaps better world.
So, apart from coming to India to play cricket, as you do, have there been any other literary excursions to India? I think you mentioned that you needed to come and do a little bit of nosing around for a character that you were including in your book and TV show, Folks and Fiction. Could you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, well, I came to Chennai when it was still Madras in the early 80s, and I played cricket here actually at the Chetpet Stadium. We were playing against Madras, which was a really big ask, because the team I was coming with was a newspaper team from the Guardian newspaper, a lot of guys with rather large bellies, and who'd once been okay but weren't very good now. We went to practice at the ground the night before, and I fell into conversation with the captain of Madras, Venkataraghavan, who was a very nice man, and I said to him, as we were having a beer in the pavilion, please, you must understand that we are just a newspaper team, and please don't put out your first 11. And he said, my dear chap, there's no need to worry. Our team is greatly weakened by the number of our players in the test match against Pakistan. Which is very kind of him. Anyway, I did strike my first ball for 4, but things went downhill after that. No, I came with the BBC to Delhi, and then we went up to Shimla. One of the characters we were talking about was in the Rajesh Quartet by Paul Scott, this horrible man called Merrick, who was a policeman and then a soldier for the British Raj, and brutally treated a young Indian man, had him locked up for suspicion of a rape which he had not committed. And it's a great book, actually, 4 volumes of it. And this character we were treating him, he was an example of a villain in literature. and he is a gay sadomasochist, and he likes to dress up as a Pathan tribesman and go out cruising in the night. And he is eventually murdered by a rent boy dressed up in full Pathan tribal robes, after 1,000 pages of villainy of various kinds.
That's what happens.
It is a great character. It's a wonderful book, and we had a great time filming in Delhi and Simla. But when I got back, the BBC had a terrible loss of nerve, and they said, do you think we could rewrite this without mentioning the fact that he's gay? And I said, this is the point where I leave the program. Yes. I mean, this is just ridiculous. But the BBC is a strange and very neurotic organization. I mean, the editor of the program was himself gay, very happy about it. Half the people who work at the BBC are gay. There's absolutely no problem. We're all very modern. But they were worried that some pressure group somewhere might tell someone else in the higher echelons of the BBC that if you're going to have a gay character, he should have been more sympathetic or whatever. Anyway, it all passed off absolutely fine, and people quite liked it.
At the end of it. Well, just speaking of brutality, just because a line from The Fatal Englishman came to mind. For those of you who don't know, very quickly, it's 3 short biographies of 3 short lives. And the first one is of Christopher Wood, who was a young painter from England, and he moves to Paris to become an artist. But there's a line here where you say he possessed at an unconscious level the ruthlessness that art requires. And I was wondering, what is this ruthlessness that art requires, Sebastian?
Oh, that's rather a good line, isn't it? So it's very nice to be reminded. God, it's so long ago since I wrote that book. Anyway, the ruthlessness that art requires. Well, I suppose in the life of Christopher Wood, he was a very beautiful young man who was taken up by high society in Paris. But you have to concentrate on what you're doing to the exclusion of all other things. And this means finding time. So partly it's a question of being ruthless with your time. And most writers find that they can't make a living from writing, so they have to have another job. Teaching seems to be what a lot of people do. But you have to be pretty ruthless about, therefore, your time. Don't take work home with you. Be ruthless about the weekend, which is when you're going to be writing your books, because that's when you're not working. Don't go out. Don't go to the party. Say no. Don't keep up with your old friends. Don't develop your relationship with your new girlfriend or boyfriend, because otherwise your book won't get written. It's that kind of ruthlessness, and it's a question of, particularly I think when you're young, no one believes they can do this thing. No painter believes that he can really paint a great painting, because we're all children, we're all imposters, we're all making it up as we go along. Particularly when you're young, you think, who am I? How can I possibly do this? And you have to have this extraordinary self-belief, bloody-mindedness, determination to put 2 fingers up to the world and say, I will show you, I will do this. But the only way you can do that is to get up very early, stay up very late, and sometimes behave quite badly as far as other people are concerned by putting yourself and your art in front before them. That's the sort of thing I meant.
You know, what fascinates me, Sebastian, is that you've been writing for a good number of years, and your nationality is English, you write in the English language, and just to also quickly go back to something that you mentioned yesterday at the award ceremony right here, that you feel that English literature has been enriched and been revitalized by writers who haven't necessarily been born in England, but who write in that language as well. And I was just wondering what your experience has been over the past few years as a writer in English, and quite a classical writer in some senses. What your experience has been of this sort of ever expansion of this umbrella of English literature.
Yes, I mean, it's a big question to which there isn't an easy answer, but I wasn't just being polite yesterday when at the prize giving I said that Indian writing had really helped to revitalize Indian writing in English had helped to revitalize the British novel. I think it really has. But just largely because there were so many talented writers, beginning with Salman Rushdie and then Rohinton Mistry and all the others whose names are familiar to all of us. And they brought an ambition, I think. It was just really, I don't really think it's so much a cultural thing. I just think it's an ambition. And the British novel had become very small, very inward-looking, and people were writing a lot about their own lives thinly disguised. And here were guys who were writing on much bigger themes, longer books, with vaulting ambition, much of which had been copied, I think, from South American writing. It's a sort of circular thing. I mean, Rushdie certainly borrowed a lot from Garcia Marquez and so on. But it did, and you know, we're English. The language is now by far our greatest export, since we're a very diminished power economically, politically, globally, which fine by me, incidentally. But the language is by far the most important thing we have given to the world and continue. I mean, there are staggering statistics about the number of English speakers in the world. Not as many as Mandarin, but actually, if you take it second language, more. And, you know, we're very proud of our latest Nobel Prize winner, who was born in Nagasaki, Kazuo Ishiguro, and didn't speak English till he was 6, I think. But he seems to have made a pretty good fist of it. On balance, a success, I think you'd say. But of course, there isn't really as much traffic in Europe as you would think. I mean, there are really only 2 European writers who are much read at the moment in England, who are Knausgaard, the Norwegian, who personally I don't care to read. You know, a teenage boy wondering whether or not he's got enough money to get beers to go to the party or not, over 8,000 pages. And Elena Ferranti, who certainly does have something fresh and vital, I think, in her voice. But, I mean, I don't think... For instance, Patrick Modiano, the French writer who won the Nobel Prize, I think 3 or 4 years ago, barely published in England. And it's published on a sort of one of those, you know, minute presses where it's published on print on demand kind of thing. Michel Houellebecq is published in England, but barely read. But, and likewise, you know, going back the other way, it's always been France, the British writers they like are not the ones that we like. The people that we think are a sort of national joke to them, they're very keen on. It's very, very sad. France is a very strange country, indeed. I mean, they think they're very uncertain about Shakespeare. Reluctantly, they've come to accept Shakespeare, but they really think he's a barbarian compared to Molière and Racine, because he doesn't accept the Aristotelian classic unities, and he has too many vulgar characters, low characters, and so on. And the other person, the second greatest English language author, according to France, is Edgar Allan Poe.
Oh, right.
Who, you know, frankly is a bit of a joke to us. But anyway, there it is. It's fun. I mean, France is one of the great things about being English, and there are still some great things about it. Our one-day cricket team, for instance. Only the one day, sadly. I'm still certain that Jason Roy is related to Arundhati Roy, by the way, deep down, somewhere back in their ancestry. But one of the great things about being English is that you're only 20 miles from France. And this is like another planet. I don't think that two places geographically so close in the world could be historically, culturally, intellectually, emotionally, so utterly different. And I've been going to France all my life, and I'm still only beginning to get to the bottom of the French psyche. I mean, the French idea of country, of patriotism, is just bizarre. It's nothing like Indian nationalism, patriotism, or British, or German, or any other kind. French people believe that France is God's chosen country. Right. And that is not believed by ordinary, ignorant people. That is the belief of the intellectual class. It takes you so long to get your head around that. It's taken me my whole life. And finally, until you understand that about France, you don't really understand anything.
Anything at all. Shall we have a small little excerpt about Paris? I think most... oh, wait, I missed that. Okay, right, that's fine. Just a very short little excerpt from Sebastian's well, most recent novel, even though you have a new one coming out in September, called Paris Echo. But just a little excerpt, and then we'll sort of round off with a final question and some questions from the audience. It's right here.
I'm not sure I've got enough hands. Oh, so I think I was going to manage it okay. This is the main character of this book, Where My Heart Used to Beat, is a psychiatrist, and I'm very interested in the human mind and why we are mad, basically, because we're all, well, 1 in 100 of us is clinically psychotic, and how did this happen, and so on. Anyway, my main character is, this is in the 1960s, and he's been given time off from his hospital clinic to write a book. And he wants to go somewhere away from England to clear his mind. And he wonders where to go. And he says Paris was the obvious choice. It was close. I spoke passable French, and the exchange rate was helpful. I'd been to Paris a fair amount in the past, usually for conferences. I liked the art galleries, the metro with its enchanting station names, the islands in the river, and the cathedral with its flying buttresses. It was a very handsome city, more so than London. But there was the smugness to deal with, the speech of grunts and shrugs, the barely concealed affection for the departed Nazi occupier, its void August lay religiosity and fixation with appearances, the way people listened to and admired themselves in the act of talking, the surliness of its waiters, ticket sellers and shop assistants, the boiling little hotel rooms with their floral wallpaper, its willed ignorance of other cultures. None of this mattered in the course of a 3-day conference, but for writing a book, which would presumably take some months, I thought it would be better to go somewhere more congenial. I'd liked Rome, but perhaps too much. I might be distracted from work by the glow of the cobbled streets, which looked to me like film sets inviting me to play a part. Eastern Europe, being under Soviet control, ruled itself out. I was intrigued by the idea of West Germany, but I didn't know how I would react to living among men who had killed my friends and murdered 6 million others in their death camps. The fact that the Germans were, in looks, culture and aspiration, the siblings of the British, seemed to make the problem worse. If I recoiled from the collaborators of Paris, still sulking over the outcome of 1944, how might I respond on a subway carriage full of recently serving Nazis? Really, I wanted a better, older Europe, in a city that had not been barbarized by the 20th century. Such a place must exist, I thought, outside the long cast of nostalgia. I wanted a city where, if you had sat at a table in the main square in 1905 and said, by the end of the century, Europe will have changed from this world of czars and kaisers and archdukes and kings to a place of elected leaders where all men and women can vote, the inhabitants would have said, that sounds like a good plan. Let's be careful how we put it into action. And if you had then said, in fact, that transition can only be achieved by genocide, across a century, tens and tens of million dead, pogrom upon purge, slaughter upon Holocaust throughout Europe into Russia, the people of this city would have escorted you to their small but well-run lunatic asylum.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So I have a rather jaundiced view of Europe in the 20th century, as you can probably gather.
Do you? We would have never guessed, honestly. One last question, and then we throw it open to the audience. I was just thinking how even with this small session, how we've maneuvered from one time zone to another. You've talked about Birdsong that you wrote 25 years ago. We've, mentioned a book that's out in September, Paris Echo. You've read from Where My Heart Used to Beat. I'm just... The other day, you just landed and you had to sit in on a session and answer questions, jet-lagged, probably thinking, I need breakfast in my head. So I'm wondering how do you negotiate time as a writer, as a person? Because we live this present life, we live the life that we're writing in our books, the time that we're writing in our books. We're moving between our books all the time. How do you negotiate that?
With great difficulty. I keep losing things. I lost my phone in here yesterday. If anyone finds a black mobile phone, it's mine.
It's returning.
It has a picture of a funny little girl on the front, aged about 2, with sticking out teeth. That's my daughter. The phone is unlocked, so if you find it, you can just ring one of the favourites, starting with Veronica, who fortunately is first on the list of favourites, who is my wife, who's somewhere here, I believe. I think she's probably helps me navigate time, actually, by bringing me tea first thing in the morning and knowing not to speak to me for the first hour of the day because it's just simply not worth it. After that, it's fine. But I'd like to write a book set in the future at some point. I did try a little bit in a book called A Possible Life. Set about 50 years from now, an Italian neuroscientist discovers what they call the neural substrates of human consciousness. In other words, this thing we have, consciousness, which no other animal has in the same degree. And that was set in the future when, by accident, she discovers this. And it was kind of fun writing about a future world. So maybe that's where I'll go next.
Fantastic. Thank you. Can we have quick questions from the audience?
Good morning. You said you copied from Emile Zola, Tolstoy. What did you copy from Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Albert Camus, Kafka, and D.H. Lawrence? And your name has do you have a Swiss name? In Switzerland, every 100 person is called a Sebastian.
Oh. Have you been inspired by any of these other writers that he mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, Camus you mentioned there. Yeah, I mean, there's a nod to Camus in my new book, Paris Echo. I love the opening of his books. My mother died today, or was it yesterday? Words to that effect, L'étranger. My new book is a lot about Paris and its France and its relationship with its former colonies in North Africa. Yeah, the thing about influence is that you've got to be pretty careful about it. I mean, when I first started writing, I just wrote hopelessly slavish imitations of people with very strong styles of their own, which you really can't do. You've somehow got to absorb what they have to offer you, analyze it, but don't copy it, and forge your own voice. Forge is a very interesting word in English, because it can either mean to make fake, I forged a signature, or it can mean I made very strong and sure, I forged the iron in the blacksmith. So you have to forge your own voice. God, that's a brilliant coinage, isn't it? I must remember that. Make a note, somebody.
We'll all steal it.
But your own voice is a sort of mixture of other people's, but in the end you break free. And also, of course, you use a different voice in every book. So when people say, I don't like Sebastian Faulks' style, I mean, they're really talking nonsense because I don't have a style. I have different styles in every book. I'm afraid I also have to discount it when they say they do like my style, sadly, if I'm being logical.
Any other questions? I think there was a gentleman here, yeah.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. I'm sorry I came late because I was in another session. Now, your reflection on the French, and though there is a lot of truth to that, but since we are discussing about writing and the writing stuff, being a writer, also what is the journey of self-critic, encounter and transformation of a portrayal of another culture and a responsibility to find different streams? For example, in French society itself, both historically and contemporaneously, especially in literature, there's a deep stream of cosmopolitanism. So how does one discover that stream of cosmopolitanism beyond a kind of nationalistic look at another culture?
I think it's very difficult writing about other countries from the point of view of a citizen of that country. And so when I've written books set a lot in France and America and various other countries, but basically they're seen through the consciousness, through the eyes of an English person or British person. With the exception, actually, of my second novel, The Girl at the Lion d'Or, which all the characters are themselves French. I'm not sure I would dare to do that now. You have more daring sometimes when you're young than when you're older. And my current book is set in Paris. It's all about the one that's coming out later this year. It's all about Paris. But it's seen through the eyes of the two main characters, one of whom is an American woman, one of whom is a Moroccan boy. So how do I know what a Moroccan boy thinks? Well, I've taken a gamble that all 19-year-old boys are pretty similar, really. And particularly this kid is, particularly his interests in life are sex, girls, and video games, really. I think that's fairly universal. But what, of course, what you get from using an outsider is you get their sort of freshness of perspective, and he's just overwhelmed. He's never been on an underground railway before, so the metro to him is a place of marvels and wonder. But the further thing about the culture of another country is too long and difficult to unpick at this.
Yes.
Two minutes to go, I'm seeing.
So when you copy a certain author style, have you written a scene or something and just thought that that's bad or something like that?
Well, while you mean while just writing something or writing a particular manuscript?
Like writing something, like when he's like...
Oh, right. So when you are writing in the style of someone else,
Well,
do you think that something is particularly not working or particularly not bad? Bad?
When I was writing, let's make a distinction here. When I say I copied people, you know, I was being quite light-hearted about that. I mean, I don't really... it would be easier to say I learned from Tolstoy and Camus rather than I copied them, and Zola. But then, of course, the difference is the two books, the James Bond book and the P.G. Wodehouse book, certainly, those are imitations. They're not quite parodies. A parody is when you look at the characteristics of an author and you exaggerate the most characteristic things they have until they become absurd. That is what a parody is. So when I was doing the Wodehouse and the Bond books, I had to find what the characteristics were, go strong on them, but not over the top. Because if you go over the top, then you're just taking the mickey, and then it becomes ridiculous. So I had to pull up a little short of fully stressing. But there were times in the Bond book, for instance, when I did write some really terrible bits. The sex scenes, for instance, I tried to make... He has to have sex with the Bond girl, obviously. And I tried to make it more realistic and more sort of fruity. And it was just embarrassing. So I just threw it away and just described it as Ian Fleming would have done. You know, he took her roughly and whatever. I mean, it's terrible stuff, but it works in the context of the book. But there was another time in the Bond book when I wanted him to pause. And normally what happens in the kind of novels I write is when there's been a big development, which is usually in a relationship or a feeling, I like to give the reader a moment to absorb it. So at that point, I give them a sort of gentle paragraph of reflection, so the character takes stock of her or his situation. And after a particularly explosive fight and jumping out of an aeroplane in the James Bond book, James Bond sat down and took stock of his situation, looking back at his childhood in Scotland. It was appalling. It was just terrible. So I threw that out and I just had someone come in with a gun and shoot at him. So, you know,
much better.
It's all about context.
Thank you so much. I think we don't have any more time for questions, but it's been absolutely fantastic. A huge round of applause for him.